Hi, everybody. I'm Scott, and thanks for joining me again today for another edition of the podcast in support of the film Skin on Skin, the rise and fall of the world's largest furrier. Today, I've got an interesting one for you, friends. I've got an origin story. You know, I was recently watching a superhero movie, one of those origin stories, and I just said to myself, why not? I've got all these people that we interviewed for the film telling us how they came to Evans Furs, what they were doing beforehand, many of them following their families and their own parents or aunts and uncles to Evans Furs. So it wasn't just us and the Meltzer family coming to work in the company. There was a lot of that. And there's some really fascinating beginnings here. And what I really find interesting about it, you know, it's like a sports team. And it always amazes me how after somebody wins a championship, when you'll hear the coach or you'll hear the star player talk about how it's amazing the manner in which we brought together all these people from all these different backgrounds to perform this task and come together as a team and succeed. And that's the way it feels in a successful company when you're there in the middle of it, working on it. And so there are some really nice origin stories here, and it gives a little extra background as to how the Evans Fur Company was after having gone public in the 60s into the 70s and 80s prior to things really going to hell. So before we begin, let me show you the trailer for the film, Skin on Skin, the rise and fall of the world's largest furrier.
Who doesn't love a rags to riches story? But a rags to riches to collapse story?
There were two Evans Furs. The one that climbed to the top of the highest peak, amazing story, and the one that tumbled from that peak decades later. But that's not the tragedy. The tragedy is what happened in between.
They live the American dream, and they let a lot of people come in and live it with them. And it was a wonderful story until it wasn't.
Coming from a generation that was so driven and willing to work 18 hours a day to be successful, there aren't that many people like that anymore.
They created something out of whole cloth, and he helped kings and queens around the world with their fur coats.
That was the era, I would say, the golden era of department stores and specialty stores.
Genetics loads the gun, but it's the environment that pulls the trigger.
Non-existent parenting, and so they didn't learn how to cope with stresses.
And I just look at the damage that my father created and the things that he has said.
But it certainly caused a significant rift in the family and families, and you know, a number of us didn't communicate with each other for a long time.
You marry into the family, you marry into the business, because that is your life.
Clearly, there were problems.
Okay, so let's get going with our origin stories. The first one I'm going to show you is from the former CFO of Evans Furs, Patrick Regan, who came to Evans in the mid-1980s and was there for a dozen years or so. And he talks about coming to Evans after Herb Grant's retirement and Evans' secondary stock offering in the 80s, and subsequently spending a dozen or so years there, as I said.
I came right before Herb retired. After they did the IPO, some of the underwriters said, you know, you got to have somebody a little different in the CFO position. So we let the audit be completed while Herb was still CFO. And after that was done, I took over after that. But had a couple of really solid years prior to me coming on. I think the cold blast that I think happened in 85 really pushed the product quite a bit. Plus, what was really interesting is the affordability of furs was attainable by more people. You didn't have to wait to get married and have a husband to buy you a fur. More women were working, and they could basically buy their own furs. And the company grew wildly. I mean, all the lease departments were expanding. They opened own stores, like in San Antonio, Phoenix, all these locations, which did remarkably well in their first couple of years of being open. And when I got there, it was pretty solid. I mean, it had, 2 lines of credit. One was Continental Bank, and the other one was American National, neither of which exist any longer. And also a term debt with Prudential, I believe it was. And everything was fine. They raised a lot of money during the IPO. David got a lot of money because he sold a lot of his shares. So things looked pretty good. And then things changed.
As I said, one of the really special things about Evans and about a lot of smaller family-run companies like Evans of the era was the family feeling that they had. And as I said, many people followed aunts, uncles, parents, cousins into the business. And Jim Leitz, who was one of the fur buyers and spent dozens of years at Evans Furs, tells us how he and his father came into the business and subsequently what it was like during that time back in the late 1960s.
My father started working for Evans out of the military, and he worked downtown till 1971 when they opened up Yorktown. He was there by himself for a while, but then he said, I can't work, 9 to 9 every day and Saturdays and Sundays. So, then they finally sent out one guy. He had a lot of people that worked for him. In those days, they trained you because you had to be tough. You had to be tough. And, when a customer doesn't leave until somebody like my father goes in there and stands in front of the door so you can't get out. He had, a lot of the store managers, they were idiots. So he got, he would say, this guy's an idiot. He's never here. In those days, you had one of the guys that was working in Yorktown. He was a sexual predator. He would, he would hang out with the young girls, and sometimes he would grab their tits and all sorts of stuff. He ended up, I think they fired him for sexual harassment. Then when Mike Lerman got my father fired for something that he really didn't do, years after that, Mike Lerman did apologize for doing it because he did something stupid. He lied to get my father fired because my father and him was like oil and water. It's one time Lerman came out with a bonus check. My father says, take this and bring it down to Freddie Handel and tell Freddie Handel to shove it up his ass. It's not enough money.
Interesting stuff. Like I said, think about it in terms of, you've got all these people from these different places and backgrounds coming together to form a team and try to succeed at something. Jimmy wasn't the only one who spent many years there. Bob LaBelle, who was the vice president of lease departments, and then came back for a second stint after leaving during the downfall and came back right before the end and ran Evans Furs business at Marshall Fields. He describes his coming to Evans from Montreal. Another thing I find really fascinating about a lot of these people's stories is that they came from other family fur businesses. So Evans wasn't their first stop in the industry. It was just the next stop.
I'm from Montreal originally, and my grandmother started a fur business in Montreal. When her 3 kids of age, she gave the business to the kids, and one of them was my father. I did My father passed away at 56 when I was 20, right after I got my MBA. And then what I did is that I joined my uncles and did pretty well with Furrier, and we had 3 stores in Montreal. And didn't get along too well with my uncles, and then all of a sudden, Mel Shepherd called me and said, "Hey, listen," he said, "we're looking for people here that have experience in the fur business. We can't find any. Why don't you come down?" It's not a chance. And then he called back, and, I talked to Michelle at that time. I've been married for 5 years, no kids. I said to Michelle, well, not a bad thing for us to go take a look at it anyway. Just maybe it'll help me here at Montreal and so on and so forth. So we decided to go, and I met the big guy, Mr. Meltzer, A.L. Meltzer, for about a year or two. But when I got there, it was very thoughtful, but very nice. And then I met with Sam Fields and David, and they offered me a job. That time they were doing about, $16-17 million in business. Basically, what I did at first, so he got me in the lease department as a matter of fact, as a second to Mel Shepherd, which has been there for a while, and could teach me exactly what the company is and so on and so forth. So I met with everybody, including Sam Field, and so give me a couple of days, I'll let you know. Finally, I just said, what's the risk? What a great experience to go with Michelle in Chicago anyway. I'd never been there. I didn't even know where Chicago was.
My mother was a model at a store downtown Philadelphia, and my father went to work at that store. Somehow, I don't know how, ended up in the fur department. With his knowledge of furs, he became well known in the business. And somebody from Chicago offered him a better job, more money, and a managerial job. My father and mother picked up and moved to Chicago, not knowing a soul. And my father went to work for this man for several months and found out he was a goner and couldn't work for him anymore. So he quit, and he said to my mother, I'm going to open up my own store. They put an ad in the Tribune, in the Sunday Tribune, for squirrel scarves, which were very popular in the early 30s. And somehow he came up with the name Evan, and he rented a storefront in the State and Lake building. And Monday morning, my mother and father walked up the how many flights it was, and women were lined up 4 flights down by the squirrel scarves. This is in the midst of the Depression, and that's how the business got started. They sold out in an hour.
Sharon Bass would go on to become the general merchandise manager in both the fur division and the apparel division. And here she discusses coming up in the Evans Fur Company in the apparel division as a youngster while still in school and working her way up in the dress and apparel division and trying to figure out if this is the career that she wanted to have.
I think I was about 17 years old. I was a child, and I worked part-time as a salesperson. And they saw that I had some brains and could do more than that. So they kept taking me away and always saying, here, you can do this and you can do that. And you can run the cash register. They really only wanted certain people doing, obviously, the cash registers. And I never had any chance to make any money because I was making, I think it was $1.70 an hour, which is unbelievable these days when you think about that. And finally, I said, I'm not going to keep doing this because I'm not making any money. So then they said, okay, well, we'll raise your salary. I think they gave me a whopping $2.75 then. And they had me go off of sales. Then there was a woman who was in charge of the apparel division. Her name was Bernice Myers. And she was Oh God, she was a wonderful person. She was very tough though, very tough. And evidently she must have been seeing me doing all this stuff and doing well. And she came to me, and I was going to college part-time at that point. She said, "I'd like to make you an assistant buyer." I was so petrified when I was talking to her. "I'd like you to become an assistant buyer." But it meant I had to quit school. And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Miss Myers, but I don't think I can do that." And, she probably was offering me, oh, it was so exciting. I was going to be making maybe $20,000 a year then. And I lived at home. I went home and talked it over with my parents. And, they really wanted me to go to college. So I would have been the first child to have gone to college. They said, "Well, why don't you give it a try if that's what you really think you want to try out?" And I became a dress buyer.
There are quite a few of loyal, devoted people who spent their careers there or much of their careers there until Evans went under. In fact, had it not gone under, they might have spent their entire careers there. Another one who spent decades there and began in the late 60s was Marty Cohen. Marty began in Chicago and describes his work in Chicago prior to his going on to lead both the Chicago divisions and the Cosmos divisions down in Texas.
I was friendly with Barry Novick from high school, and we were sharing a job with one of his other uncles, and I guess he started to work with his uncle Sam Field, and they were looking for new blood, and once I got there, I saw they needed new blood. All my grandfathers were working there at the time. And that started it. I started in the vault on the 3rd floor, and that would be the West Vault. If you're prefer, we got Sal Marks, we got Get Mr. Geller, Gene Greenfield. That is no question about it. Was there. Leo, I can't think, not Leo Rohatch. He was a buyer, but there was an older guy. Anyway, I can't remember his name. But Helen Goodwin was the haberdashery or the hat lady. This is 1608.
Evans was famous for it. I mean, they gave everybody an opportunity to, to excel.
Evans, they wanted everybody to be book smart, but you got to be street smart. You can be a genius, but still be an idiot.
Things are good. We're opening stores. We're doing very well. We were in large, successful malls. We were busy every day. Everything was brand new.
I always find that pretty funny listening to Marty's his take on things. Chris Nielsen worked for Marty down in Texas in the Cosmos stores. He was one of the managers there, and he too came to Evans after prior fur industry experience. And so Evans obviously was getting really good as it was expanding and opening up in all these cities at finding people who had fur experience and didn't have to be put through the meat grinder, so to speak, with the training program in Chicago, because there was a point where the company was growing so fast that it was hard to keep up with getting the new hires in there. And here Chris tells you how he came to Evans Furs.
With Evans from 1995 till about, from 1985 till about, I'm going to say 91. I had been with a couple smaller fur companies. Zordiner out of Dallas. I was with Lloyd's out of Denver for a while, and had an argument with Lloyd's about ethics, and they didn't have any.
So I left and went back to Austin, where I was from, where my family was, and knew all along kind of I wanted to be with Evans in some capacity. So I joined Coslo's down there. And then they moved me to Fort Worth, and then the rest is history. Out to Philadelphia, saw the East Coast, went to DC, ended up back in Texas. And yeah, it was a good trip. And it was pretty good when I joined. I mean, parties, and they fed everybody well, and the buying trips we got to go on to Chicago and New York. And yeah, it was a fun time.
When I was a really little kid, the elevators were all still manually operated in that building, and there were steel grates, and his office was in the corner of the 5th floor.
I would come in on Saturday mornings after dance class, and I would come into the building, and I'm on the 1st floor, and there's an open cage elevator in those days.
And I remember going to visit him, and he was so mad at somebody in his office that day. Maybe I was 7 or 8 years old.
My father's on the 5th floor, and I could hear him yelling at somebody from the 1st floor.
That I could hear him screaming at somebody from the 1st floor lobby elevator coming from the 5th floor.
I remember hearing him scream at people in his office, and I was all the way out by the elevator through closed doors.
But after he got done yelling, he was a pussycat. And I walked into that office, and it was like he had never raised his voice. It was like Jekyll and Hyde.
But on the other hand, everybody in the company both respected and admired him.
They were in some kind of a meeting, and AL said something my dad didn't like. Now, my dad had a temper. It took a lot to get him to show his temper, but when he did, it was blackout angry temper. And AL said something, and my dad leapt across the table and started choking him at a meeting. Security had to be called. He had to be pulled off of him. Security drove him home. And I don't know why, but he didn't get fired. My understanding was that he made some critical comment of an idea of my dad's. AL admired him for standing up for himself.
Ken Morgenstern is another one whose father also worked at Evans prior to his coming there. And he was going to join a family business down in Texas, which the parents got rid of, and had to figure out what to do with himself. And his father said, why not Evans Furs?
My father was hired by AL, and he worked under David. That's about when he left. About when I got involved with Evans, when he left, that was in the mid-'80s. His father and grandfather were furriers. They were mechanics. They were manufacturers. So it was in the blood. And I said 1,000 times during my life I was going to get out of it, and I never did. I don't know how he got connected with Evans. So my parents had a business in Dallas. That's where I currently reside. And they sold the business. And my legs were taken out from under me. I didn't know what I was going to do. My dad said, this is a pretty interesting thing because you disregard a lot of things your parents say, but it turns out they had some wisdom. My father said, I said, Dad, Evans, why would I go there? He goes, you will learn, son, you will learn. And so I worked for Coslo's in Dallas, which was owned by Evans at the time. They had just acquired them, and they sent me to the executive training program. So that's how I got involved with Evans. I was a trainee, and as a trainee, they send you to most of the stores, and you will either fill in as an assistant manager or a vacation manager until you get your placement. But I was very new, and I was in the Michigan Avenue store. A man walks up to me and just kind of gives me a few questions that were kind of odd. Turns out it was David Meltzer. And I said, do you know who I am? He said, you're Phil Morgan's son. And I said, correct. Because if you learn one thing or something to that effect, he said, don't make the same mistakes your father made. And then he turned around and walked away. It wasn't the reception I was looking for. You know, it was more of an insult. It wasn't a word to the wise that in general don't make the mistakes your anyone's father would make. It was more, oh, your father, you know, I have to cut him down and cut you down at the same time.
And then there's the Beckers. So Larry Becker is one of the producers of the film. You've heard us speak to him and of him prior. His cousin Jeff Becker also spent many years at Evans Furs, and they both followed Larry's father, Paul Becker, who had been in the fur business for many years and ended up at Evans and then ended up running Evans' New York office. And here are the Becker boys talking about how they made their way to Evans Furs.
My dad was actually a third generation Furrier. His grandfather hailed from Germany, and he was in the fur industry in Germany. My grandfather then joined him in Germany, and when he immigrated to the United States, he started a fur company here in New York. Then my dad joined him, so inevitably I had to follow. I ended up following into the fur industry because of my dad. My dad was actually working at Evans. He got to Evans because he was a manufacturer in New York. He actually left the fur industry for a few years and was not happy with being in he was in the China and gift industry and decided that he wanted back into the fur business. Evans being, you know, the leader in the industry and someone that he did business with. It was Walter Warren, who was running their New York office at the time, that basically invited him to join Evans, and he left Florida and moved to Chicago. My folks had gotten divorced, and I was in need of some fatherly guidance. And I actually made a trip to visit my dad in Chicago, and I packed for a 10-day trip and never left. He got me involved at Evans. He got me a job there, and like I say, I didn't leave for 16 years.
I was always attached to the fur business because my grandfather had a fur company, and his company was called Becker and Hiller. And as a kid, you know, we'd always heard about it. You know, my dad, my uncle, you know, that was what they grew up with. And my dad decided to take a different route, and my uncle stayed in the fur business. And as you know him or knew him, Paul Becker, he was kind of, I always looked up to Paul my whole life when I was a kid. And, you know, I always wanted to, you know, do something or work with him. And, you know, he had his own businesses, and then he had, I guess, enough connections in his network, and he knew the folks from Evans, because I think he sold to Evans in the past, and he joined Evans Fur Company. And I know at one time he was in Chicago, and then he moved back to New York, which is where I grew up in Long Island. And I was just close to him. He, you know, when he moved back to New York, we spent a lot of time together. I know he brought my cousin Larry into the business as well. So I was watching this all through junior high and high school going, I want to do that too. But, you know, made a deal, like, I'm definitely going to go to college. I'm not going to not go to college. And you know, I'll have some type of backup if I can't, you know, do something in the business. Right. And when I graduated, I took an interview with someone who, you know, called Barry Novak. And I don't know where Barry is these days. But I interviewed with Barry and a few other folks in the New York office at the time, and they made me an offer to join the company and spend a few months in the New York buying office. I worked on both sides of the wholesale business and Black Diamond Group, which we had too, which was attached, if you remember, in that office. And then they asked me to go to the executive training program in Chicago after the summer.
As I said, some really fascinating, unique origin stories there. Wouldn't you agree? It's always amazed me how we all came to this place and this point at that time, and at the time when the company was right at the top of its peak, just before it was about to tumble from the other side of the mountain. And a great group of people. We all really enjoyed working together. We were all very dedicated and loyal to the cause. And I think what you'll see when we talk about the other side of the origin stories, what people did after Evans Furs, is you'll see, upon reflection, the lament that most people had about having to not be with that company any longer.
You know, it's in my blood, just like your family. My mom worked in the New York office, and she was back then what they used to call a secretary, and, you know, like a receptionist, and then the showroom model. And my dad was in what they called at the time a training program, and his mentor, who was Sam Field, took him on the buying trip to New York. And they literally would spend probably 5 or 6 weeks every summer in New York because there were so many buildings and so many people to see. So he told my dad, hey, you know, there's this girl in the office. She lives in Brooklyn. You know, I'm going to introduce you. She can take you around and show you the city and all of that. That, I believe, was in July of 62. They got married in November of 62. And I was born in April of 63.
Well, go. That was quick.
Math. Not so nice. Don't do any math because it's not the greatest thing. But yeah. So and then my mom moved to Chicago, right? Yep. You know, they got married, and they got married in New York after knowing each other 3 months, and moved to Chicago, and were married until he passed away in 2019.
I'll go first. I looked at Evans, and I still do, connecting with people. I am grateful to be doing this right now and that you are doing this to connect the people together. It was a weird circumstance how we found you. I was screwing around on YouTube, and I think I put in fur or something, and Skin on Skin came up, and I thought, what's that? And then I saw Scott Hunter. You know, I poked around and saw Scott Hunter. I said, I know that guy. So anyway, that's how that happened. But I look back at Evans as, number one, it's how in the foundation of my life, how I live my life, but taught me so much about a bigger world than the world that I grew up in. And I think that is something I will always cherish.
And lastly, friends, before we go, let me show you the trailer for the second part of the film, coming soon, Skin on Skin, The Rise and Fall of the World's Largest Furrier, Part 2.
Julius and Rose Meltzer went forward with the belief that their son's death was an accident, and this setback rocked the family during a time when brother A.L. and Herman's Evans Furs was skyrocketing to the top of the industry.
Those Meltzer kids obviously weren't taught how to cope or how to parent or you know, relationship skills were really lacking, and that got passed down.
All I know is that he had a photograph of him where he was brilliant, and the family loved him.
Yeah, I think she loved the way I looked, so she was always, you know, like I was her little doll.
All of his grandchildren wrote reports on Nuremberg at some point in school. And someone would always have an assignment, interview some relative about something.
Nonchalantly would toss a question out, and the beads of sweat were pouring off as he's trying to answer Uncle Bernie's question.
A lot of people live in fear that, you know, oh my God, is that going to happen to me?
In the end, a lot of people got hurt. A lot of customers got hurt. It was just a bad thing.
He's with his dinosaur. toy dinosaur on the table. And he says, you know what happened to these dinosaurs?
It was a very unique era.
Jeff and I got some calls, and people were just sobbing.
Well, they shut the doors on people. That was pretty high profile.
A fish has got to swim and an eagle's got to soar. That's their natural temperament and how they want to live and how they want to play. And when that's blocked, people are really unhappy.
As always, I cannot wait for you to see these films. Part 1 is making its way around the movie festival circuit as we speak. We're in 2024, going into 2025. And later in 2025, we will have completed Part 2 of the film. So I can't wait for you all to see that. And there's still Part 3 coming. So at the end of the day, we will have a couple of dozen of hours of content related to the rise and fall of Evans Furs, the Meltzer family, the Rose and Julius Meltzer family and their descendants, and everything that took place from 1912, when the Meltzers came to America, until 1999, when the Evans Fur Company shut for good.
Julius was a rabbi, and Rose was a spinster. She was 29 years old when she got married. Her brothers bought her a husband. And he had 3 kids, and I don't know which one of them or both of them decided they wanted to come to America. But Rose would only come first class. He had several wealthy brothers who were part of the engineering crew for the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And they wanted to get rid of her. And they bought her, her husband, and the 3 kids first-class tickets on a steamship.
Until next time, friends, thank you for joining me as always. I'm Scott Hunter. I can't wait to reconvene with you on the next episode of this, the podcast for Skin on Skin, the rise and fall of the world's largest furrier. Have a great day. See you soon.
On the next episode of the Companion Podcast, in support of the film Skin on Skin, the rise and fall of the world's largest furrier,
we have another fun one lined up for you today. I had so many calls and texts and emails.
I really knew from the time I started in the business that there was no way.
I started working for the company in the 70s, in like the mid 70s, and it was huge.
Had wanted me to come into the business. He was upset with me that I didn't come into the business and pressured me to. Then I did. But it was a really, really rocky thing because
they must have treated the staff well. Family was a different story, but and family was expected to go 1,000% above and beyond. And I understand that.
I enjoyed the company. I enjoyed going to visit. Always had a great time whenever I was there and getting to know the people.
1980, I wasn't ready to wear. So it was a different experience than being in the fur business.
On the next episode of the Companion Podcast, in support of the film Skin on Skin, the rise and fall of the world's largest furrier,